Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. Today I want to talk about paint again. Specifically, the paints manufacturers tell us to paint our models in, and how I believe it could be holding back your modelling. Whether you're a newcomer to modelling or have been making kits for a long time, this might seem a bit counterintuitive. Surely a model company that has researched a particular aircraft or vehicle, an often individual subject, has all the information to give you the best advice possible? Well, yes and no. Many companies do excellent research. I think the current airfix and ICM design teams are great examples of this, with things like the 148th Sea King being an obvious case in point. Many of these companies also produce their own paint ranges, either in-house or through outsourced services, so they are in an optimum position to produce the correct colours and shades that you need for any given subject, right? Well, they might be in the correct position to provide that service, but none of them actually do. Look at the current ranges from model manufacturers. Humbrol has about 165 colours, Revell 88, Tamiya 85, and ICM 80. Now compare that to a paint manufacturer like Vallejo. Their model air range has 169 individual colours, the game colour range 108, model colour and metallics 92, mecha colour 72, premium colour 52, panzer aces 48 and metal colour 17, giving well over 550 different paint shades, and this doesn't include their express paints, weathering and diorama paints, washes, varnishes and mediums. Now that isn't to say that any of the model manufacturers' paints are bad, just that their ranges are going to be more limited than those from a dedicated paint company. Because those model companies want you to buy into their complete range, they recommend their own paints. As they have limited ranges, that means they need to make compromises and suggest whatever colour they have that is closest to what the actual subject's colour is. Revell and Tamiya sometimes take a slightly different route here, one that I actually admire and think is good practice. They ask you to mix different colours from their range. That acknowledges that they don't have the exact shade needed, which is admirable in itself, but also introduces you to an important area of the hobby that I think is very much overlooked by many beginner or even intermediate modelers: mixing colours. Let's have a look at some examples to demonstrate what I mean here, and we'll take something that all of the manufacturers I mentioned do: an early RAF aircraft from World War II. For airfix, Revell and Tamiya, I've chosen the Spitfire, for ICM the Beaufort. Here are the colour indications for each. This is what those colours look like next to each other on a Spitfire, and you can plainly see the difference between them. So which is right? I'll come back to that question in a moment. There's also another model company I haven't mentioned yet that also produces its own paints, and it's one we don't tend to think of much in the scale modelling world, and that's Games Workshop with Citadel paints. There are over 300 of these paints, and although they're not key to any historical reference, that doesn't mean that you should dismiss them. There are also a host of other paint manufacturers out there, from AK through Hataka to ProAcryl and SMS. We have never had such a choice in the hobby. Don't be put off by what the brand is manufactured for either. Chimera Colours, for instance, are single pigment paints really designed for miniature painting, but they're high quality, pigment dense, acrylic emulsion based paints. In essence, they're no different from a lot of the other paints we use. In fact, they're probably better than most. Likewise, because something is in the Panzer Aces line from Vallejo, doesn't mean that you can't use it on an aircraft, a ship, or even a Warhammer model. There's nothing special about them that makes them adhere only to German AFVs. They're just paints. So what is the right colour? Well, simply put, there isn't a correct colour for a model. It doesn't matter what historical paint chip a colour has been referenced to, if a paint has been formulated to that exact shade, it'll be wrong for a model. Why is that? Well, as I've mentioned on many live streams and in a few videos, colour doesn't really exist as an absolute. Well, what does that mean? Well, what we perceive as colour is actually reflected electromagnetic radiation of a particular set of wavelengths in what we term the visible spectrum. We call it that because it's a small segment of the electromagnetic spectrum, which varies from very high energy short wavelengths like gamma rays to long wavelengths like microwaves that we use in cooking or on our mobile phones. Now, our eyes contain structures, called rods and cones, that can detect photons, little packets of light, in a certain range of wavelengths. Rods are our low light vision receptors. The cones are the ones responsible for detecting colour. Now, most humans can see around 1 million different colours. This is because a healthy human eye has 3 types of cone cells, red, green and blue, each of which can register about 100 different colour shades, amounting to around 1 million combinations. In terms of shade variation, the human eye can perceive more variations in warmer colours, reds, oranges and yellows, than cooler ones like blue or violet. This is because almost 2/3 of those cones in our eye are red and green, which process the longer wavelengths of light. Essentially, there's more overlap, so there's more information being reported to our brains. Humans can generally distinguish between wavelengths of just 1 nanometer apart, which is pretty damn good. Those individuals we commonly refer to as colourblind have some of these structures that are absent or inactive, so they perceive certain colours differently. They can still see colours, they just can't distinguish between some wavelengths in the same way most people can. Other creatures, such as insects and snakes, often have structures in their eyes that are certain to certain wavelengths which we can't perceive, like infrared or ultraviolet, giving them an expanded visible spectrum. Other species also have more types of receptors, potentially giving them a much finer resolution of colours. Birds and butterflies are common examples. Both of these have more types of cones than the 3 that we do, though the way that some creatures process that information in their brains is also different. So what we refer to as colour is actually a perception or interpretation of certain reflected wavelengths of electromagnetic energy that we call light. We're actually exploiting that technologically now with something called structural colour, which is a surface that contains no pigment, but because of its molecular structure it reflects certain wavelengths of light, which we then perceive as colour. Because this is part of the structure of the surface, rather than a pigment, the colour doesn't fade or change over time. Anyway, back to that perception of colour. When we see more photons of light, we interpret that as brightness, and when we receive less, then it's darker. This all makes sense. However, beyond a certain threshold of light, our cones can't be stimulated, and then the rods in our eyes take over, which is why we don't see colour in low light environments. Now, say we have a surface that is painted a particular grey in our one-to-one subject, say a wing on a modern aircraft, and we see that in direct sunlight at noon from a few metres away. It will look different than if we see the same subject if a cloud covers the sun and lowers the level of light. It'll appear darker to our eyes. Nothing else has changed here, but the perceived colour is darker. Less photons are being reflected and being picked up by those cones in our eyes. In the same way, if we see that same subject not at noon, but either at dawn or dusk, then the light quality has changed and there are more photons of a red or yellow wavelength to be reflected, and the colour of that grey will appear to be warmer than the actual pigment in what we term as white light. Now if we take a 1/48 scale model of our subject, painted with the exact same paint shade and put it under all the same conditions as that actual subject, but adjust our position so it fills the same frame of reference in our eyes, it'll appear darker than our original subject. That's because it's smaller and reflecting less photons per unit area. The colour shade will be technically correct, but it'll look wrong. It'll also look like a toy, because the spectral evenness of the finish will be 48 times greater than the real thing. Gaps in seams and flaps will have 48 times less shadow, so won't be noticeable in the same way our eye perceives them in the actual subject. This is why manufacturers engrave panel lines and we use washes, not because they're an exact scale representation, but because they help fool our eyes into the illusion of reality that we're trying to perceive. Now at this point of the video, I just want to thank all of my Patreon and YouTube channel members. I mentioned that I was going to put this mid-roll in future videos in my prior video on this, and I had to add a few more names onto the list since then, so thank you so much to all of you. Your help at this time is very much appreciated. If you are able to become a channel member, it really does contribute a huge amount to me being able to keep the channel going, and at the moment it's my preferred platform for support. Okay Alex, colour doesn't exist, and even if I have the exact paint my subject is painted in, it'll be wrong. How does that help me paint a model? It's a fair question. Well, I want to try to convey 3 distinct but related concepts to you in this video. Firstly, use the colour that looks right to you. Do your research, it's the most important part of improving your modelling, and find some good pictures of what you're making. It doesn't really matter if they're photos or drawings, this is about what you are trying to create, not doing what somebody else tells you to do. Then you need to work out what these colours are. Ideally, hex codes, RGB or LAB references are what you really want here. That's because the second step is finding colours that are close enough to what you're looking for in that. Don't try to find them by what manufacturers call them, use a paint reference chart or an app. There are a lot of these around and I don't want to get into the detail of that here, since that's really an entire video by itself, but you want to have some colours that are in the right ballpark. Don't worry about what manufacturers they're from, the colours are what's important, not who makes them. Remember, your eyes can distinguish colours about a nanometer apart, which is why all of those different colours on our Spitfire wing looked so different, because they're all compromises. What we're looking for is the colour that's closest to what your eye has perceived. Thirdly, you're going to adjust those colours to create that colour that you were looking for in step 1. Write down what you're doing as well so you can recreate it again in the future if you want. Try it. You may find it's too light or too dark, but that's okay, just adjust it again until you're happy. Use small modulations of this base colour to add areas which are slightly lighter or darker to that base shade, creating some visual interest and depth to that base. This is especially important on single colour or larger models. Now all of this may not seem that different from painting with manufacturers' recommended colours, but it's really a completely different mindset you're adopting. Instead of just painting the area you're told to in shade X or Y, you're observing and recreating. You're looking at references and recreating effects. This is really what classical art training does. It gets you to look at something and attempt to recreate it as you see it. This is also why I create my little paint chits for all my paints, scan them and come up with LAB references. It makes this whole process much easier for me in finding my initial starting point. If you're wondering what I'm talking about here, then I'll link the video down below so you can check that video out too. I found this process has helped me to understand my paints a bit better, and if it works for some of you out there too, then I'm happy to share that. Now don't expect to do all of this and create a masterpiece the first time you do it, of course. It takes time. Personally, I'd take it step by step. First of all, try to find the shade of a subject and find the closest paint match to that, and use that paint rather than the kit suggested paint. Next time you can do the same thing, but you can also try adjusting the shade of that paint to better match what you feel your subject should actually look like. The next time you then come to do some painting, you can use different shades of that base to create some visual interest. During all of this time, you'll be learning about what works and what doesn't work for you, and developing your skills and knowledge. You should find that some things start to become instinctive for you, and it helps you to develop your individual style. This is what I mean by freeing yourself from the paint by numbers style of painting that model manufacturers use. It's not a criticism of that in itself. These are often excellent starting points or inspiration for us, and are extremely helpful for beginners or those of us who just want to make and paint something without any fuss. Many people enjoy painting by numbers to create a picture, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But artists go beyond that to enable their expression. As a modeler, you should feel the same empowerment and freedom to express yourself painting a model as well. You should think of the painting guide provided by the manufacturer as training wheels rather than absolute instruction. They're a guide for you until you can do it by yourself. Now I've done this myself by using schemes I've seen in books or in photos that weren't supplied in the kit, for example. I've always thought of the kit as the sort of base canvas upon which I'm going to create what I want, rather than necessarily making what the manufacturer intended. In fact, it's really only since I started the channel that I've been doing out-of-the-box builds because I want to showcase the kit rather than myself. Of course, some of this comes through anyway in the way I do models, that's my modelling style, but I haven't really made any models off-piste for a while for that reason. Of course, if that's something you'd like to see more of in the future, please do let me know in the comments below. That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.